When most people think about the Crimean War in the 1850s, they tend to think of battles like Alma and Balaclava, with the heroic but tragic charge of the Light Brigade. But what if I told you that the British and their French allies also fought a battle with the Russians on the Pacific coastline of Siberia? In a bizarre mystery that still baffles military historians to this day, the British Admiral in overall command shot himself before the fighting even began, and then the campaign went from bad to worse. This is the little-known story of the Battle of Petropavlovsk. Petropavlovsk is located on one of the most remote corners of the Earth, the Kamchatka Peninsula, a vast wilderness of some 100,000 square miles jutting out from Siberia into the North Pacific. This is a land of extremes, the home to 160 volcanoes, 29 of which remain active today, and effectively cut off from the rest of Siberia by the treacherous Sea of Okhotsk. In 1854, this remote outpost was scarcely more than a century old. The town had been established in 1740 by the Dutch-born Russian mariner Vitus Bering. Yes, the same Bering of Bering Straits fame. He named the settlement after his two ships, the St. Peter and St. Paul, and it became known as Petropavlovsk, Peter and Paul in Russian. The location was perfectly chosen. Nestled in Avachka Bay with depths of 26 metres, about 85 feet, it provided Russia with an ice-free port crucial for her interests in Alaska. The harbour was almost landlocked, protected from Pacific storms by a natural sand spit, a fortress created by nature herself. Yet, despite its isolation, Petropavlovsk held immense strategic importance as Russia's main Pacific naval base. At this time, Vladivostok, which is now Russia's massive Pacific Fleet headquarters, was still part of the Chinese Empire, and in fact it wouldn't be ceded to Russia until 1860 on the back of the Second Opium War, and wouldn't become their primary Pacific naval base until 1872. So why were the Royal Navy and the French Navy sailing thousands of miles from the main theatre of war in the Black Sea to attack this remote outpost? The answer lay in Britain's global maritime interests. The primary Allied objectives in the Crimean War were as much naval as they were on land. Destroy the Russian naval base at Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula, and eliminate Russian naval power in the Baltic. Following the declaration of war in March 1854, it wouldn't be until the September 1854 that British and French troops finally landed in the Crimea. In the meantime, Great Britain was determined to make her mastery of the seas count against the Russians. From the opening months of the war, the first Anglo-French actions were all at sea, both in the Baltic and in the White Sea above the Arctic Circle. But Britain's concerns extended far beyond European waters, with shipping routes to China, Southeast Asia and Australia carrying the lifeblood of the British Empire. The Admiralty could not ignore the potential threat posed by Russian naval forces in the Pacific. The decision was made to seek out and destroy not only Russia's Pacific squadron, but also the ports that could harbour hostile forces. It was a classic example of 19th century British naval strategy. Strike at the enemy wherever he might threaten British commerce, no matter how remote the location. And they had the resources to do it. The man chosen to lead this distant campaign was 64-year-old Rear Admiral David Price, a veteran whose career stretched back to the Napoleonic Wars. Born in 1790, Price had joined the Royal Navy in 1801 and served with distinction at the Battle of Copenhagen. His service had then taken him to the West Indies, the coast of France, and during the War of 1812, he had commanded the bomb vessel HMS Volcano in the bombardments of Baltimore and at the Battle of New Orleans. After a stint as superintendent of the Sheerness dockyard, he'd been promoted to Rear Admiral in 1850 and appointed Commander-in-Chief Pacific in August 1853. By all accounts, Price was an affable officer who showed no signs of the troubles that would soon engulf him. The Allied fleet that assembled for this operation was impressive on paper. The Royal Navy contribution consisted of HMS President, a 50-gun frigate serving as the flagship, with a crew of 450. HMS Peak, a 40-gun frigate under Captain Frederick Nicholson with 280 men, and HMS Virago, the only steam-powered vessel in the squadron, a wooden paddle sloop with just 6 guns and 149 men under Commander Edward Marshall. The French fleet, commanded by Rear Admiral Auguste Fabrier Dupont, consisted of La Forte, the largest ship in the combined fleet, with 60 guns, the Edis, a 32-gun corvette under Captain Pierre-Paul de la Grandière, a name that we're going to encounter again, and the Obligado, a 32-gun sloop. The Allied fears of attacks on their merchant fleets in the Pacific were, however, misguided. The commander of Russia's Pacific Fleet, Admiral Putyatin, only had 3 ships available: the 44-gun frigate Aurora, the transport ship Dvina with 10 guns, and the ageing frigate Pallada, which had a history of needing repairs and was in such a bad condition that it would actually be scrapped in 1856. He was in no position to seriously disrupt British and French shipping in the Pacific. So instead, Putyatin decided to concentrate his meagre forces in defending Petropavlovsk with as much determination as possible. The British and French squadrons had been off the coast of South America when they'd received orders to proceed to Petropavlovsk. Ironically, the Russian frigate Aurora, which I mentioned just now, had actually been in the same port in Peru at the same time, but had sailed just before Admiral Price received notice that war had been declared. A missed opportunity that would prove costly. The Anglo-French fleet sailed via French Polynesia to Honolulu, arriving on the 17th of July 1854. Price then sailed to Novo-Arkhangelsk, the modern Sitka in Alaska, which was then the capital of what was called Russian America. The Russians were to sell Alaska to the USA in 1867. Admiral Price found no Russian ships there, and so he now sailed towards Petropavlovsk. Admiral Putyatin's defensive strategy was simple. He used the Dvina to transport additional troops, admittedly not many of them, across the Sea of Okhotsk, and then he stripped the guns from both the Dvina and the newly arrived Aurora to augment the land batteries protecting the base. The Russian commander had cleverly exploited every natural advantage the terrain offered. The port was protected by a long narrow peninsula on the west and a sandbank on the east, with a chain stretched between these 2 natural barriers. A 5-gun battery commanded the tip of the peninsula, while an 11-gun battery dominated the sandbank. Additional batteries were positioned strategically around the harbour. The Aurora and Dvina were moored inside the sandspit, broadside on, with what remained of their guns facing seaward, supplementing his land battery's firepower. On the 28th of August 1854, the Allied fleet approached Avacha Bay. Admiral Price, with his superior firepower, decided to bombard the Russians into submission. On the 30th of August 1854, with no wind to fill the sails, HMS Virago was forced to tow the sailing ships into position for the bombardment. At 6 o'clock that morning, HMS Peak opened fire on the Russian batteries, beginning what would become a tragically memorable action. Admiral Price watched the action unfold from his flagship. At 11 o'clock, he joined his officers for lunch before retiring to his cabin. There, after writing several lines in his journal, a shot rang out at 12:15 p.m. David Price had become the expedition's first casualty. The circumstances of his death remain one of the great mysteries of naval history. HMS President's logbook records 12:15 p.m. Rear Admiral Price was shot by a pistol ball by his own hand. The Admiralty seemed convinced that it was suicide. Yet, French sources suggest he'd shot himself accidentally whilst putting his pistols in his belt. His Russian counterpart, Admiral Putyatin, was equally sceptical about suicide, reasoning in true Russian form that whilst a commander might fall on his sword after defeat, the action was only just beginning. We will never know the truth, but Admiral Price died of his injuries that afternoon, leaving the expedition without its British commander just as the real fighting was about to begin. Admiral Dupont now assumed overall command, while Captain Frederick Nicholson of HMS Peak became acting commander of the British squadron. It was hardly an auspicious start to what was already a challenging operation. The bombardment was taking its toll on both sides. The Russian ship, the Aurora, was severely damaged, in fact so badly that it would be 6 months before she could put to sea again. On the Allied side, HMS Virago took a hit below the waterline, whilst the French ship Le Fort signalled her desire to withdraw from the action. The naval battle was proving inconclusive. The Russians remained defiant behind their fortifications. Both Dupont and Nicholson concluded that having failed to destroy all the Russian batteries, the only way to achieve their objective was to put men ashore. It was a decision that would lead to a disaster. The following day, the Allies attempted a limited landing, but were promptly repulsed. Whilst Admiral Price was buried on the far shore of the bay on the 1st of September, his successors were now engaged in a fierce debate about their next move. Since the failed landing attempt, Admiral Février Dupont had experienced a change of heart and now wanted to suspend the entire operation. Nicholson, however, believed the Russians had expended most of their ammunition in the bombardment and would easily be overcome by a determined assault. His conclusion about the Russians running low on ammunition was actually correct. His belief that they would be easily overcome, however, was not. Nicholson now proposed landing sailors and marines to suppress the remaining batteries and occupy the town. The proposal was put to a vote among the 6 captains, a rather democratic approach for a military operation. All 3 British captains voted to attack, whilst 2 French captains opposed the plan and the 3rd abstained. With the vote hanging at 3-2, Février Despont, as the overall commander, held the casting vote. Personally opposed to the attack, but unwilling to have the French appear cowardly, he abstained. Nicholson's proposal therefore carried by 3 votes to 2, a decision that would prove catastrophic. On the 4th of September 1854, the assault began. HMS President and the French ship Le Fort successfully suppressed 2 of the remaining batteries in less than 30 minutes. The way seemed clear for the landing force to proceed. Due to the predominance of cliffs close to the port, it was decided to land on a beach to the south and then march up a nearby ridge which overlooked the town. Just after 8 o'clock in the morning, the land assault began in 2 waves. 120 Royal Marines under Captain Parker advanced up the hill in extended order, followed closely by 80 French Marines. Their task was to capture the high ground, allowing the French naval guns to be brought up to bombard the garrison. Simultaneously, sailors from HMS President and HMS Peak under Captain Burridge came ashore and successfully destroyed another Russian battery on the flank of the landing beach using a keg of gunpowder. So far, so good. However, as the Marines crested the ridge, they walked into well-positioned Cossack sharpshooters, supported by field artillery, that showered them with canister and grape shot. Within minutes of the engagement beginning, all of their officers had been killed or wounded. And as if this wasn't bad enough, the French naval column now arriving in support mistook the Royal Marines for Russians, and in the confusion and smoke of battle, the French sailors now opened up on their British allies, a friendly fire incident that added to the mounting casualties and confusion. The fighting on the hill lasted approximately 90 minutes, with the Russians being continually reinforced by men from the town below. At 10:45 a.m, the senior surviving officer, Frenchman Captain de la Grandière, ordered a retreat. La Grandière was already under a cloud for failing to support Le Fort during the bombardment a few days beforehand when she'd been forced to retire. His decision to retreat now added to accusations of cowardice back in France. What followed was a rout. The Russians now gave chase, with mounted Cossacks chasing the Marines and French sailors as they fled towards the beach in complete disorder. Only the steady rearguard action conducted by Captain Burridge prevented a complete massacre. Even as the survivors boarded their boats to return to the ships, Russian riflemen on the heights continued to pick them off. In a final humiliation, the Royal Marines' colour was lost when the colour bearer was shot and fell overboard. The Russians later found the Marine colour washed up on the shore, a trophy for their unlikely victory. The casualties told the story of the disaster. 107 British and 101 French were killed or wounded, nearly a third of the entire landing force. Meanwhile, the Russians had lost less than half that number, and most of them were just wounded rather than killed. Not sure how they could dislodge the Russians, with their own commanders bickering and winter storms on their way, the Anglo-French fleet departed on the 7th of September 1854, their tails firmly between their legs. The Royal Navy ships sailed to Vancouver Island, while the French made for San Francisco Bay. The following year, determined to erase the stain on their reputation, the Allies assembled a new fleet to finish the job. Command was given to Rear Admiral Sir Henry Bruce, another Napoleonic War veteran who'd actually fought at the Battle of Trafalgar and had previously served as Commodore of the West Africa Squadron. On the 30th of May 1855, Bruce sailed into Avacha Bay, but the port was shrouded in thick fog. When it finally cleared the following day, they found the town completely deserted. Taking their lone victory, the Russians had decided to abandon Petropavlovsk. Deprived of an opportunity to avenge the previous year's humiliation, the Allies burnt down part of the town and destroyed the remaining gun emplacements before departing on the 12th of June. By now, attention had moved to the war on the Crimean Peninsula itself. The Anglo-French force had landed in September 1854 and was now besieging the Russian naval base at Sevastopol. The battles of Alma, Balaclava and Inkerman, along with the suffering of the British redcoats during the brutal winter, dominated newspaper headlines and public consciousness, and that continues to this day. The repulse of the British and French at Petropavlovsk stands as one of the only Russian successes against the Western Allies on any front during the Crimean War. Not surprisingly, the Russians are keen to remember this particular battle. For the British and French, it was an episode that they preferred to gloss over quickly, and luckily for them, the public were more interested in the battles in the Crimea than some port on the Pacific coastline of Siberia, which perhaps explains why this remarkable action remains so little known today. Well, I hope you enjoyed that little snippet from the Crimean War. Thanks for joining me today, and I look forward to sharing more stories from British history with you very soon.